Good morning, everyone, once again, and thank you for joining us this morning. I am going to start slowly introducing today's webinar as more people join our call. I wish to thank you for taking the time to join our webinar, as well as our esteemed speakers. Just a reminder to everyone that today's event is going to be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Malta Business Bureau's YouTube channel, and it will also be sent to anyone who subscribed to the MBB mailing list, just for your information. I would like to ask for everyone to keep their mics muted so that you do not overlap over our speakers. You will have time to interact with them in the Q&A portion of our webinar. So, the title of today's webinar is Digital EU, Future-Proofing Your Business. This event is being hosted by the Malta Business Bureau. I know that some of you, or most of you, have attended our webinars in the past and are familiar with the MBB. But for those who aren't, the Malta Business Bureau represents the Malta Chamber of Commerce, Enterprise and Industry, and the Malta Hotels and Restaurants Association, with offices both in Malta and Brussels. One of our main tasks as an organization is to provide information to the Maltese business community with regards to EU policy and legislation, which relates to the operations of daily operations of businesses. And we do keep businesses up to date in the sphere of EU funding as well. So that's about MBB in a nutshell. In introducing today's topic, so the EU's digital rulebook has grown to keep pace with the technological and innovation landscape. And it has exposed our businesses to high compliance costs and, in some cases, legal uncertainty. So to combat this, the EU has proposed a digital omnibus adopted by the Commission in November 2025 and takes shape of two distinct proposed regulations. So first we have the digital omnibus covering the data, cybersecurity and privacy rules. And on the other hand, you have the digital omnibus on AI, which puts forward a series of targeted amendments to the AI Act. And that would be what we're discussing today in a nutshell. So without further ado, I wish to present today's agenda. So following this brief introduction, we have an overview on the digital omnibus by our esteemed guest from Brussels at DG CNECT. Following that, we have some minor notes and key policy takeaways from what we've just heard, and we swiftly move on to a panel discussion on the digital omnibus, the cybersecurity 2, and the Digital Networks Act. This will be followed by a brief Q&A session, and by 11:30 we should be concluding our webinar. And with that, I think it's time to introduce our first speaker. So Mr. Wojciech Saryuz-Wolski is the acting head of policy implementation and planning units at DG CNECT within the European Commission, where he leads the main coordination unit for the interinstitutional relations, policy planning, better regulation, and regulatory simplification. Mr. Saryuz-Wolski, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much. I'm really very happy and privileged to be here at the invitation of the Malta Business Bureau. Let me please give you a brief overview of where we stand with the simplification agenda in the area of digital regulation. I think without much exaggeration, we can say that this current mandate of the EU institutions, which has started 15 months ago, has brought an extraordinary and truly unprecedented political push on regulatory simplification and burden reduction. And this across all policy areas and in the digital domain in particular. The informal leaders retreat that took place in February and the last week European Council definitely reconfirmed this emphasis on burden reduction and simplification as being a cardinal point for Europe today. And this is also definitely something on the absolute top of the agenda of the Executive Vice President Virkkunen and of DG CNECT, which I will represent here today. People like you, the voice of the business community, and in particular the SMEs and startups, calling upon us to go far and bold with our regulatory simplification agenda has been an absolutely critical factor in inducing this change of policy focus. And I think being here with you today, I can say that with the digital omnibus proposal and the launch of the digital fitness check, we have made some serious and decisive moves in this direction. The digital omnibus might have not been the first one. We are counted at the so-called omnibus number 7, so there's a lot of other ones in other policy areas, but I would say that arguably we are one of the more prominent ones and definitely one of the most discussed among the stakeholders as we are here today. I'm absolutely certain that many amongst you know our proposal almost by heart, and probably some have even written position papers on the topic. But let me just take this occasion to recall the key elements of what we proposed. So first, we proposed to make light touch adjustments to the AI Act to ensure its effective application. And this covers not only postponing the application dates for the entry into force of rules on high-risk AI to enable sufficient time for the delivery of the support tools, but also additional measures in support of compliance, experimentation, real-world testing, and innovation. The work on the AI Omnibus by both co-legislators in the Parliament and in the Council is advancing at a really high pace, and the trialogue negotiations are starting actually already this week. And on the side of the Commission, we very much hope to see a positive result of these negotiations still before the summer. Then, second element of our digital omnibus is the data part, and here our proposal is to streamline 4 legal acts down to just one, the Data Act, to clarify the application of rules for our startups and scale-ups, and to incentivize data sharing. Third, we make targeted adjustments to the General Data Protection Regulation (GDPR) to ensure that legal ground when trying to innovate in the digital economy while maintaining the level of protections of our citizens. Fourth, with the proposed single entry point for reporting cybersecurity incidents to various authorities, we want to offer a practical digital solution for companies to avoid duplication of costs. And fifth, and the last part of our digital omnibus proposal, we propose to repeal the platform to business regulation, an important and initial legislative initiative in the area of platform regulation, but which is by now mostly outdated with the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Service Act regulations being in place, which has taken over from platform to business regulation. So these are the main 5 points that the Commission has put on the table back in November last year. There is always a natural question coming from many corners, is whether what we propose in the digital omnibus fit for purpose. Some of you will say it's not enough, some will say it's too much. The opinions differ, and they seem to differ by quite some margin, which arguably means that what the Commission has proposed overall gives a right balance. To wrap up, the objective of our regulatory simplification drive is pretty straightforward. It is to make Europe the best place to start, to scale, and to sustain a digital business. We all know the broader context. So European businesses operate in an increasingly complex global environment marked by fast technological change and strong and ever-increasing international competition. And we know that regulatory complexity carries a cost, especially for the smaller players, our European SMEs and small mid-caps, whose interests are at the very heart of our simplification efforts. At the same time, regulation is essential to ensure trust, fairness, and safety. And I cannot stress this strong enough, we are not rolling back on the shared objectives of our legislation and what makes us distinctively European. But we are looking where we can optimize compliance, where we can be smarter, and where we can do better. The digital omnibus for us is just a first step. In parallel, we are also working on a digital fitness check. And this analysis will be looking into the cumulative effect of our digital rules. This exercise will inform us where further in the longer term, we should look for improvements and optimizations. And for this, we need a continuous dialogue with industry and stakeholders, like this one today, for which I really want to thank again the Malta Business Bureau. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here today, and with this, I would like to finish my introductory speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time, for joining us, and for giving us this brief yet comprehensive overview of the Digital Omnibus. Before we move on to our panel discussion, I just wanted to echo the points you made, as well as the business sentiment. So European businesses, as we can all agree, cannot afford barriers at a time when strengthening industrial competitiveness is more important than ever. And from our discussions and from our research and from our daily interactions with businesses, we do all agree that we need to move away from imposing additional burdens on companies that are already investing heavily in the digital transformation. On AI, of course, it has the potential to strengthen productivity, something that has endless potential to be tapped into. And we support, as well as support the development of quality jobs. But only if the EU creates the necessary breathing room for European companies to continue investing and innovate in a responsible manner. So that would be our thoughts with regards to AI. In the case of processing personal data for scientific research purposes especially, this will be tackled more in depth in the upcoming panel discussion as well. The removal of redundant steps should level the playing field, enable broader participation in valuable research without compromising data protection. And finally, something that we always harp on is the clarity, proportionality, and having a cooperative regularity approach can make GDPR a source of empowerment and rather than a constraint. So I think those four key takeaways from our business community summarize and echo what you've just presented to us. Wojciech, would you have anything else to add to the conversation today?
I think you said it all. Thank you very much again for the invitation, and wish you a very, very good panel discussion.
Perfect. Thank you so much once again for your participation. And with that, we shall move on to our panel discussion. So for today's panel discussion, let me first introduce what we'll be discussing and then move on to our panelists. So we are currently witnessing, as we've been hearing this morning in the first 15 minutes of our webinar, that we have a pivotal shift in how Europe governs its digital future. So for years, the feedback from the private sector, included voices like Business Europe, has been clear. Our digital rulebook has become a fragmented bottleneck that is increasingly difficult for businesses to navigate. So in response, as we've heard, the European Commission has moved from a period of rapid regulation to a period of refinement and infrastructure building. So for today, we have three topics that we'll be discussing during the panel. The first would be extensively the Digital Omnibus. So this, as I've said in the beginning, all began in November 2025, with the proposal of the Digital Omnibus. This is a strategic attempt to mold our technology laws into a more coherent framework. The goal here isn't to add more rules, but to solve the compliance bottleneck by making the existing rulebook more predictable. It's about maintaining our high standards for safety and trust, while ensuring that technological sovereignty doesn't become a synonym for bureaucratic complexity, or that's what we hope for. The second point would be on the CSA 2, so the Cybersecurity Act 2. So in January, the momentum continued with the presentation of the Cybersecurity Act, or as I might refer to it, CSA 2. For context, the original CSA introduced an EU-wide cybersecurity certification framework for ICT products, services, and processes. So what the European Commission hopes is that by updating the certification framework and reinforcing ENISA's mandates, the EU is effectively turning ENISA into a norm setter for the industry. And then when I'm referring to the acronym ENISA, I'm referring to the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. And while certification technically remains voluntary for now, we have to look at the reality of the market. Through procurement requirements and supply chain expectations, these standards will likely become de facto licensed to operate in Europe. So it's no longer just about being secure, it's about being provably resilient. And in terms of the Digital Networks Act file, this was also proposed at the beginning of the year by the European Commission. And if the Omnibus is the rulebook and the CSA is the shield, then the DNA, which is the Digital Networks Act, would be the engine here. It's a modernized legal framework designed to boost investment in advanced digital infrastructure. And without the connectivity this act promises, the innovation we discussed today simply won't have the tracks to run on. So the question here is, do these new initiatives truly solve the business world's compliance bottlenecks, or are we simply building a more sophisticated maze? So to unpack all of this, I'm joined by our 4 speakers who I have on our slide. I ask all the speakers to turn on their camera, please, if possible, and I believe all have joined our call this morning. So first off, we have Mr. Gavril Flores at the MDIA. Mr. Flores leads the National AI Strategy and Vision Regulation of AI, Data and Cybersecurity and drives business development, legal policy, and quality and integrity on the regulatory structures. Then we have Michael Camilleri, Chief Technology Officer at MVC, who specializes in leveraging technology to streamline compliance, transform one of the business world's most persistent bottlenecks into a seamless operational advantage. We're also joined by Dr. Dylan Seychell, lecturer in artificial intelligence at the University of Malta, where he leads a portfolio of funded research projects spanning AI news analysis, environmental intelligence, and AI literacy. And finally, we have Dr. Deo Falzon, Senior Associate at Fenech Fenech Associates. Deo practices mainly in technology, media, and telecommunications, and specializes in intellectual property, where he advises on obtaining IP protection, dealing with infringements, and assisting filing strategies. So thank you all for our speakers for joining us today. Having introduced what we will be discussing, we will be tackling questions based on categories. So first off, we'll start with Digital Omnibus. And my very first question is to Deo. So the Digital Omnibus promises a single entry point for reporting cybersecurity incidents, hacks, and data breaches to cut down on red tape for various laws across the EU. Can you provide examples of cybersecurity incidents? What are we talking about here? And what qualifies as a cybersecurity incident? And as a second question, as a follow-up to that, how does the single entry point actually act as a legal safety net? Deo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Everyone, and thank you to the Malta Business Bureau for this invitation. First we need to unpack a bit the question, I think, because it's quite a loaded question and it has a lot of definitions built in, etc. So I think we need to be aware of the fact, I'm sure most of the audiences, but the digital omnibus is not one regulation in the way that regulations are usually found, but it tries to amend a number of other regulations, all within the digital sphere. So vis-a-vis cybersecurity incident, the digital omnibus does not introduce like a single harmonized definition, because those definitions still emanate individually from the various other regulations, sector-specific regulations, if you will, that each have their own definition of a cybersecurity incident. And in fact, not even all of them call it a cybersecurity incident, So, for instance, the digital omnibus affects the NIS2, it affects the GDPR, it affects DORA, it affects IDAS, and also the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, to mention. And each of these have separate indications, separate definitions of what an incident which impacts a service provision is. So with NIS2, you can speak about a significant incidence impacting service provision. The GDPR will speak about a personal data breach likely to result in high risk to individuals. DORA might speak about a major ICT-related incident. And the Critical Entities Resilience Directive will speak about incidents disrupting essential services. So the digital omnibus will not affect those definitions. Those definitions will remain as they are, but what the digital omnibus will introduce is a single administrative way, let's call it that, a single point of entry where a business can deal with them. Now, just briefly, examples, as we know, NIS2 does not affect each and every business, because NIS2 affects critical and important entities, essential entities. You can have a ransomware attack, for instance, on operational systems, which will engage NIS2, but might also engage a personal data breach. And that is the issue with these kind of cyber attacks. Although the regulations are separate, it will be a single cyber attack which can have multiple implications, triggering a lot of notification obligations on businesses. And this obviously makes it hard to keep track of, makes it hard to report, because you need to say, okay, if it's a personal data breach, I need to assess that with the IDPC, for instance, to give you an example. Or if it's a breach under NIS2, you have to notify the CIPRD, for instance. So there is all of this fragmentation. Now, unfortunately, or call it what you will, the fragmentation will remain in the sense that there will still be, at least to my knowledge now, there are still multiple timeframes to comply with. But what will change is the fact that, at least, although the details are still being ironed out, on how the single entry point will work, is that a business doesn't have to keep track of all of these kind of potential avenues where to report, but it will report to in a single portal of sorts. So that is, I think, the major simplification. And it acts as a legal safety net. When we say about legal safety net, I think it reduces the risk maybe of non-compliance through omission. Sometimes a business might suffer a cyber attack, but it might be more focused on the downtime that it is experiencing, rather than joining the dots and thinking, listen, there's not just a question of downtime, but potentially personal data has been breached, so I need to also report that, and I have a different clock that is ticking for that. So all of this has the single point will reduce the inadvertent non-compliance. It can also create kind of a retrievable record of sorts where entities can just keep track of the report, and it also imposes, at least should impose, some standardization if templates are developed, for breach notifications, etc. So one take-home thing is that the single entry point, so it does not change any internal governance obligations. You still need to check your contracts, your DPAs, your breach response procedures, and the notification chains which vary across regulators. But it will cater for the last mile of the reporting process, and therefore it is not, of course, a substitute for having all the policies and the internal procedures in place. I hope this answers the question fully.
I think it's very well explained. Just for the sake of our audience, when you're referring to NIS2 and DORA, what are you referring to? So what's the full?
Okay, actually, so NIS2 is kind of, you know, a kind of reporting mechanism that exists that mandates security, cybersecurity over specific entities. It is not a regulation, it is rather a directive that is transposed in Malta. It has actually been published and made into effect a couple of weeks ago, although the transposition had been ready since last year. And vis-a-vis DORA, it has more to do with financial institutions. So it only applies largely to financial institutions. So not all types of businesses need to be aware of it. But this is what the digital omnibus does. You know, it gathered all of these regulations, all of these potential directives that all have a cybersecurity flavor or a cybersecurity or a personal data as well implication, and it has gathered them, and it is trying to amend certain or clarify certain issues with them.
Thank you for that. So still within the digital omnibus, I'm going to ask you, Deo, another question before we move on to our next panelist, this time focused on the GDPR. So the omnibus suggests that if a specific business cannot reasonably trace data back to an individual, it might no longer count as personal data for them. Opponents claim, and this was heavily opposed, opponents claim that this proposed change to the definition of personal data as they go far beyond a targeted and technical amendment of GDPR. So what does the change in definition or personal data mean for Maltese businesses, and why was all of this opposition to it?
Okay, I mean, really and truly, first and foremost, I mean, GDPR is something harmonized. So this is not just an implication for Maltese businesses. Really, it's an implication for anyone dealing with EU, with personal data as understood by the GDPR, which is personal data relating to European citizens, basically. So the way it has developed, I mean, personal data has had quite a static definition, I would say, since quite a number of years now. And until at least the first directive, for sure, back in 1995, you know, and it was always defined as personal data, I mean, as any information, okay, which relates to an identified or identifiable natural person, and that is quite critical. Identifiable means that it could be that the natural person is not identified yet, but you have information to build the identification. The way it is as a definition, it is already quite rather a relative concept. You know, it's not an objective concept. Personal data is not objective. Personal data is relative because it depends on other factors on whether you can build an identity or not. So I think the major problem that I've seen commentators and the EDPS and the EDPB, which are kind of these supranational commentators, regulators, etc., which are made up of the individual national authorities, supervisory authorities of data protection. You know, they came out guns blazing against it because it seeks to add some certain specific language, which I can read out. So the digital omnibus seeks to amend the definition of personal data and expand it a bit more by saying that information is not personal data for a given entity if that entity does not have means reasonably likely to be used to identify the natural person concerned. So it also clarifies that information does not become personal for an entity simply because a subsequent recipient has the means necessary to identify the individual. Now, to be clear, since, as I said, you know, personal data has always been relative, there has been case law about this, you know, so, I mean, the concept pretty much remains the same because there has been case law which on a case-by-case basis has interpreted these facts. So the criticism is that what the Commission is trying to do is trying to codify one aspect of case law. As you know, case law is developed by definition, on a case-by-case basis in relation to a specific fact pattern, So that's how case law works. You have proof, you have evidence of what went on, and then there is an assessment of those specific factors. So the criticism is that by codifying this long-winded explanation or definition of personal data, you are reducing the effectiveness of the case law, because you are probably, you are blocking kind of the interpretation that the courts can make, because obviously a law cannot account for all the potential variables that real life events can have. It will undermine the certainty of a specific interpretation, and that to me as a practitioner might be more of a problem, because obviously I'm not a political commentator. I am more concerned about giving certainty to clients, for instance. Just to concretize it a bit more, what this means is that, for instance, you have a company receives a data set of pseudonymized records for research purposes, for instance, but the key linking those records to an individual is not held by the company itself, but it is held by someone else, by a third entity, etc. This is what this definition is playing around with. It is an entity relative approach kind of to identifiability. So if under the current system, personal data is not purely objective, so pseudonymized data remains technically still personal, but the GDPR application to it depends on whether the entity can realistically re-identify the individuals. That is a fact-specific, relative assessment. It is not an absolute categorical rule. And that is precisely, I think, why some commentators are finding the Omnibus Amendment as controversial, because it tries to convert that fact-specific assessment that usually the processor, the controller, the courts will make into an explicit categorical rule that removes kind of this residual objective element. That is, I think, the main issue with it.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. I do remind our audience that if they have specific questions to what we're currently discussing with our panelists, to use the Q&A function in the chat. We will be getting to the Q&A portion at the very end of the session. And a small reminder that when you're writing your questions, do please specify which panelists you're addressing your question to. Okay, so with that, thank you, Deo, for your input on these first two questions. I'm going to give you a break and move on to Gavril. Gavril, we're still on the topic of the Omnibus. However, now we're moving on to the topic of AI. So the Omnibus mentions an EU-wide AI sandbox by 2028. Can you describe the scope of the AI sandboxes? More importantly, how can Maltese businesses and startups benefit from the existence of such sandboxes? And how is Malta preparing for the implementation of the EU AI Act?
So thank you very much for your question, and thank you for organizing this webinar. So basically, Malta had already created an AI sandbox 5 years ago. That means that Malta was the first country in the EU to create a sandbox by a regulator. That gave Malta the advantage of, for example, just to share with you that last week we were invited by the AI board to present what we learned from the last 5 years on the sandbox. What the AI Act did is introducing a requirement for each member state to create its own sandbox. So now we will have an obligation on each member state, unless they want to cooperate with another member state and do a joint one, to create a sandbox in every member state. Our current sandbox, we cater for regulatory aspects, but in principle we focus primarily on the technological aspects of AI. What is the gap that was identified? The gap is that certain AI systems, such as general purpose AI systems, like OpenAI, Gemini, etc., those will be regulated under the AI Act directly by the AI office within the Commission. So why, if you're creating a system for a company in Malta or in the EU, which is high risk, for example, or if it's maybe part of a medical device or a toy, that you can go directly to the sandbox of the National Competent Authority. In case of a general purpose AI system, so we're talking about these large models who use a number of petaflops to operate, so they need high computational power, there wasn't a sandbox specifically targeted to those, because it's very pertinent to note that if you are an active participant in a regulatory sandbox in the EU, the fines of the AI Act, unless you do something intentionally, would not apply for the time period you are in the sandbox. So sandbox have a number of advantages. They provide a testing environment. They reduce your legal liability because you're under the strict control of a regulator. But while we have these sandboxes in member states, and Malta we have already a sandbox, which once the implementing act will be published, will be transformed into an AI sandbox under the AI Act, there was this gap which the AI Omnibus tried to address. Our position as Malta is that we should have clear delineation which sandbox applications should be accepted by member states and which sandbox application should be accepted at EU level. The rationale being because we already have a framework for cross-jurisdiction recognition, that if you see conformity assessment in Malta, that is already recognized across the EU. So we want the Omnibus to be clear in terms of what can be accepted or not at EU level. So that's part of the, in fact, ongoing negotiations, which as Malta we are pushing for. And I believe that there's a number of advantages for Sandbox, and they can help you to also be prepared more for conformity assessment, because a sandbox per se is not an approval of an AI system. You have specific questions or you have specific milestones which you want to address, and you have the regulator hand-holding you together in Malta with a technical expert to address those concerns. So I think that the proposal addresses a very important gap, yet we want more clarifications in terms of clear delineation of roles. There are clear advantages for businesses to join the sandbox: more preparedness, liability up considerations, improvement of the system, because at the end of the day, the better AI system you have, it becomes more competitive, and it's more to the benefit also of the end user and the consumer. But also it does not lead directly to conformity assessment. What does that mean? It means that high-risk AI systems, which are found in Annex 1 and Annex 3 the EU AI Act, those require conformity assessment in case of Annex 1 by independent conformity assessment body. It's an independent party recognized by MDIA and the National Recognition Board, and so which requires accreditation. And in terms of Annex 3, it is you can do it in-house. And I think for those systems which are under Annex 3, we understand that sometimes there is lack of capacity by companies to sustain conformity assessment. In that regard, what the MDA is doing is taking multiple measures. The first one is the sandbox per se. The second, we partnered with the university to develop a course on foundations on AI and also to prepare for conformity assessment. And the third, we have an infrastructure already established at MDIA with a team, with a help desk dedicated on AI supervision, with a high-performance computer, which is available for businesses and SMEs to use for their computational requirements. So I would say we offer the whole package, both in terms of support, test before invest, support and financing also through our partners like Scienza Malta when it comes to research and innovation, and with the measures and support and division when it comes to deployment of AI solutions. So if anyone Of course, we are not consultants. Our role is not to act as a legal advisor of a company. We are the regulator. But the main point is that you'll find the MDIA's open door policy to support companies, and it's something that we'll do on a daily basis, where we meet companies and provide them objective and unbiased information on the requirements of the regulation.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. And in fact, this is very important, very interesting to know that Malta is leading in this sense. So on the same note, so we're still speaking about AI in this case. However, I'm going to direct my next question to Dylan, who's joining us from the University of Malta. So the Omnibus delays the high-risk AI rules until the Commission confirms support tools are ready. So can you explain to us what are high-risk AI rules, something that's already been touched upon? What could delay be problem? Why could their delays be problematic for Maltese businesses, and how? Dylan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and well done for organizing such an important event. This is a very important and critical area, even for anyone building and developing technology in Europe. And most of the time, from my side, from a technical perspective, it's already very difficult to keep up with the scientific developments and technology developments in AI, let alone then adding to it another layer of regulations. So such events are extremely important. From a high risk perspective, we refer to systems that somehow are deployed in a situation where they can affect people's lives. So we're dealing with hiring or recruitment, educational systems, assessment, credit scoring, and so more or less the philosophy is on the right track, because that is the type of AI that we really want to make sure that we're getting right, because any technical challenge today is ultimately a human challenge. So it will affect humans at the very end. So we have to make sure that whatever we're building is done right. I even confirm and fully support Gavril's intervention. So the sandbox is highly beneficial. As an island nation state, we were one of the first to venture in this area, and I have assisted different entities in this sandbox, and even participated using my through my projects, and I found it really, really beneficial, because it is an opportunity to even bounce different ideas and different plans in the project, and you have direct feedback from an individual technical expert, and even from the regulator on where you're going, so you don't end up building something which needs to be scrapped and then doing it again. So having an open conversation in the sandbox really helps, particularly if you're dealing with such high risk applications. On the other hand, high risk applications, we have to be careful, right? Because high risk applications, yes, they do have an impact and so on, but they can also provide very good opportunities in terms of competitiveness and even the betterment of society, right? Because if they're built well, because we cannot assume that they're going to be built maliciously or defective. So if they are built properly, they can have a very positive impact on society. So I think one important message to get across is that we shouldn't keep back from venturing into high risk applications, because just like in business, something high risk, fine, can have a high impact, which can be negative, but it also have a very positive impact. So while making sure that we're regulating, we have to make sure that we are not sort of stopping or slowing anything of the sort. The delays, it's a two-edged sword, right? So on one side, it's good because they sort of release the pressure now. So fine, if you're building something, you have some more time to clarify and so on. But implicitly at the same time, it is like we're either signaling that these restrictions can be somehow negotiated, they're being delayed because they can change. And if that is the case, should I be investing should I think twice before doing it now, or perhaps wait later, or should I rush it now? So it creates this situation. So if we know that something is not right, and deep down we know that we need to get rid of it or change it, I think we should, once we're doing all this effort, and from a constructive perspective, things in Europe do take time to take shape and get executed. I think once there is this initiative, it should be done in a way that at least it's definite. So we don't want a situation where we are in late 2027, early 2028. We are geared just like we were geared for the August 2026, and then there is another delay, or it move, or we change the goalpost or whatever, because that ultimately is what even affects investment in business as well. Because should you be investing in compliance, so how far should you be going there? Even as Deo mentioned before, a huge chunk of what is already there will remain there. So so we're not scrapping regulations altogether, but certain clarity on where we're going and so on, I believe is quite important, because we have to, while we have to make sure that we are regulating, we have to sort of avoid situations where we create the we'll deal with it later sort of mentality, right? So because what happens ultimately is you just lose interest in investment. Gavril, I saw your...
Yes, I want to intervene by explaining the rationale of the delays. So the delays are not intended because the legislator or the regulator do not agree with the way and what's in the AI Act. But there's a very simple reason. How the legislation is built, the legislation presents very high-level minimum requirements, and then there are the standards which are issued by pertinent bodies such as the CNECT, and also liaison with ISO, for example, how to create an AI system which is compliant with the AI Act. We are at a situation where there were delays, or there are delays in issuing these standards. So we have two options. Either ask the companies to, because there is a way in the legislation, you can still be compliant with the AI Act without the AI standards, but it's a bit more complicated. Either keep it in that context whereby you are still responsible to be compliant, but find your own way until the standards are issued. Or else we acknowledge that there is a delay, and important to note that standards are built by experts, by not just, it's not a member state issue, it's built by experts for practitioners and providers. Or else create a timeline, a new timeline by when these standards, hopefully, because that's the tacit agreement here, that they will be published. So the delay is not intended because we don't believe in what's in the UAI Act. I give you an example. If you are a high-risk system, you are required to have technical documentation in place, to have a quality management system, to identify what are the main risks of the system, to do tests for biases, for example, data validation. So we're not saying that those things are not important. What we are saying is that we want people to do them according to established standards. And rather than, in an ideal scenario, the standards, if it was planned by the EU, would have been already published, and then there wouldn't be any need of a delay. So the delays are intended to give standardization bodies to ensure that the standards are developed also in consultation and in liaison with industry and providers. So then companies can be in a better position to actually implement without having the stopgap mechanism whereby I do something and then in 2 years you tell me again as a economic operator that I have to do it differently because now standards are published. So that's the main intention here. That's the main intention. Dylan, muted, Dylan.
Dylan, you're still muted.
So, I mean, it's reasonable. My concern, to be honest, is that the same argument would then apply as well for standardization. So there was this issue of delay because of the legislation until standardization took place, and I mean, all of this is a very important conversation to have. So we're dealing ultimately in an area that is changing monthly. in practice. I mean, we have noise weekly, new products and so on, but essentially we're dealing with technology that is changing, even at a product level, it's changing really, really rapidly. Scientifically and engineering, it's slower, but from a product perspective, it's and to compete, it's really so. Having such delays, I appreciate the complexity and the rigor that is needed from a standardization perspective and even from a regulatory perspective. But those on the ground building and investing in technology, most of the time the message is sort of put it on the back burner and then we'll see, because a lot of startups might not even exist by the time that that these regulations are in place. So for in the startup world, 2 or 3 years, even for validating in a landscape where everything is changing, you're competing with other continents where they have no hint of worry about any of these considerations, that your startup in Europe might not even exist by the time that those situations are in place. And we have to also make sure that if these regulations are there to control the big players and those who are actually having some sort of effect on society, I think that can be faster and can be even more. But Europe has to sort of decide as well where these things are going. And just an advice, if there is anyone who can actually consider it, is some sort of proper support to startups and anyone working on new projects to strengthen ourselves in terms of compliance as well, because that is an additional overhead that even if we use the de minimis limits on compliance, we're not even not even starting to compete. So the minimis should be used, from my experience, on pure R&D, so that you can push the economic operators forward to actually create and build new technology. If they end up burning the de minimis limits on compliance to sort of keep up with all these changes that are too macro for any startup to do anything about, then again we're defining another objective that we should be looking at a European level. From my side, I think that's enough from for now.
What I can add is that just a minute, that our help desk is free of charge. The support from the help desk does not constitute de minimis support, yet we will be issuing also vouchers together with our partner Scienza Malta to help companies identify whether their system is high risk or not. So we will be issuing voucher next month, end of next month, basically, to support, to identify whether, to get advice whether your system is high risk or not. What I can say also, that I'm sure that most of the AI systems, independent of the standards and independent of the regulation, serious operators, and I'm sure Dylan already does it already, you already do validation of the system and thinking about bias and thinking about, so a lot of considerations are there. And with regards to large players, the general purpose AI systems, there was a code of conduct which is applicable to general purpose AI systems, and this is targeted to large players which have a high impact on society, and that is already published. And that's already applicable for industry.
Just to clarify, locally, even when I compare to other countries, we are lucky to have entities like MDIA and the Hub accordingly, providing a very healthy space for anyone in Malta working in this space, right? So I have to be clear that even though there is sort of this macro environment from an EU level, locally, even the regulator is very proactive and is very close to what's happening on the ground. My concerns, even being voiced today, are more from a macro level, sort of where is Europe going rather than where Malta is going, because Malta is very rapidly being a first mover in most of the areas in this topic. We are very agile, even from a regulatory perspective down to anyone implementing. But of course, we're not the ones actually controlling what's happening from a macro direction in Europe. So we are being reactive as a country simply because the goalposts are even sometimes shifting from a higher level. So I wanted to clarify this as well for anyone operating or wanting to operate in Malta.
Thank you both, Dylan and Gavril, for extensively exploring this question and discussing within the local context. I don't want to dwell on it too much, given how many more questions we have to go through. So Dylan, the next question is also for you. This time it's on something we touched upon in the previous section of our webinar. So the Digital Omnibus proposes a clear definition of scientific research to allow for data processing for innovation. Can you explain to our audience what AI training entails, please? How are today's students being prepared to utilize AI to further close the academic business divide? So let's start off with that.
Okay, just to clarify the question, AI training, the training of the system, or training people to use or about AI?
Training people to how to use it.
Okay, all right, okay, because we use an AI, we have no new words coming in, and we borrow all the vocabulary from whichever area that comes across. So that's why training is one of them. We train AI models, but we of course need to train people. So yes, there are different levels, right, of training. Most of the time, or traditionally, we have always sort of put on top as a priority formal education, right? So even economic structures and educational structures have always been built in a way that you sort of have formal qualifications and then use of formal qualifications accordingly. But in this case, that system is too slow to prepare everyone for something of this scale and nature. So what we have to understand is to layer it up. So first of all, there's the importance of literacy. So Malta is also one of the first movers even in this. So there is the National AI Literacy, which is currently being built and designed between a collaboration between the Malta Digital Innovation Authority and the University of Malta. And I'm leading the efforts from the university side on this matter. And the idea is to create a program for every citizen in Malta, right? So whoever is actually operating in Malta can have access to this technology. And the idea is that there is this course that provides a very practical introduction to fundamentals of AI, how you use it in everyday life, how you use it in learning. And the idea is how can we equip every citizen with a very basic level of literacy to know what AI is, what it is not, when we should use AI, when it is not a good idea to use AI, where we should be careful, notions of bias, etc., that Gavril just mentioned, digital well-being related to AI, and even productivity and opportunities that arise from AI. Once you have that level of literacy, then everything else can build upon that level of literacy, and that is where the real opportunity comes across. So then you have different pathways. So within a few years, we will look at artificial intelligence just in the same way we look at mathematics today. So today, there are courses that specialize in mathematics. You can really study mathematics. But in practice, there are many other courses that use mathematics as a language or as a tool within it to do something else, engineering, architecture, etc. They do study some components of mathematics, but it is not a mathematics course. In AI, it will be the same. So until now, from a formal perspective, AI has been, we have the Department of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Malta. It's been here since 1995, so it's not something which is new. So Malta has been for decades now working and researching this area. We have degrees specialized in artificial intelligence, undergraduate, postgraduate, masters, or PhDs, etc. So we have that scientific level. But now, as we're seeing, AI is being used now in different areas, in education, in whichever area. So the even training and capacity building even nationwide, and eventually it will be the same all over the world because there is no other option, is that every subject needs to have an AI component in it. How can you use AI to do whatever you're doing in an effective way? And also the idea of literacy and even the awareness, and then we can go up even different levels of usage from literacy to fluency to dexterity, but I think that's for another day. It's an idea. The idea is that you also know how to switch without AI, so you end up knowing your real core subject that you're going to do, how you can use AI to do it better, but then at the same time being able to switch off AI, do it on your own, and then switch to AI, etc. The idea is to fight even over reliance on AI, right? So how can we be productive, but at the same time we do not lose the basic capacity of communicating, critical thinking, etc., which is all very, very important altogether. One last point is that AI works on information and data. So we cannot be proficient users of AI. We cannot use AI efficiently in any area if we are not educated even on the information. So AI builds on that information. So we have to be careful to analyze information, think twice, ask questions, investigate further, be cautious what we are believing or not, discernment, etc. So those are skills that before we move to AI, we have to make sure that those are even quite fundamentally important, and even the National AI Literacy Program handles this even as horizontal notion throughout the entire course.
Thank you for that information. I think you're comprehensive enough that I can move on to our next question. So now we're moving a bit away from AI as well. Still on the Omnibus, Michael, this question is for you. So the EU claims the Omnibus will save SMEs millions via simplified documentation. Can you walk us through the challenges that Maltese SMEs and business in general face? And in the real world, will these proposed rule changes actually translate to lower legal and administrative bills for a typical local business, or is this wishful thinking? Your opinion on this, please, Michael.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Christine, for the invite. I want to start with that we touched upon trust. So the point of doing compliance is so that we increase trust between our business community, and especially when we're creating digital products, because digital products are very complex in nature, and the fact that they fall under different regulations as well makes it even more complex for businesses to invest, as was touched upon earlier by some of the panelists as well. So I want to emphasize 2 points here. First of all, compliance is a delicate balance. Fair enough, we need to be able to trust the products that we use, that we buy, that we offer to citizens as well, and even especially if they're on personal devices. And on the other hand, there is the question of intent. So the fact that we're talking about this in the AI sector, but AI is just one component of the design. When you're creating a product, you're probably touching upon a lot more tools in your arsenal and probably trying to get that product as quick to market as possible. So there needs to be some kind of intent. Like if you decide to include a component in your architecture and eventually the end product and offer it to a business, to a user, or whatever in between, even government at some stage, there needs to be a careful design of that component, how it fits into the solution, and if it has a purpose as well. So by all means, if you have the opportunity to use the AI sandbox because you have AI in it, go to our friend at MDIA and make use of those services. They are very well equipped to aid businesses of different capacity, and to that end, the Omnibus helps in that regard, because the fact that there are a lot of fragmented rules and laws, even between, there's a lag also between the EU and what Malta is transposing, this also, it may deter investment as well. So the fact that there will be one rule book going forward, the fact that there will be consolidation, and hopefully a bit more clarity on the subject, I think that is a very good step forward. Now, to address your second question, the lower legal and administrative burden. So my take on this is that no single business will save millions on it, especially because there are a lot of SMEs, especially around Europe, and there is no single business that will bear the brunt of the costs. Having said that, Gavril mentioned caps. So the cap is interesting because the cap allows you to take advantage of economies of scale. Having said that, companies like startups or SMEs who don't have to avail of that mechanism, they have other tools at their disposal. And something that is being ironed out in law is that you can choose whatever vehicle you need for your product or for your business. Depends on your situation. So it is even more important to get the consultancy in place before you start creating the product so that you choose the right vehicle for you to be compliant. And I think through that approach, it may very well help the business intentionally decide on a strategy and use that strategy on their go-to-market strategy as well. So yeah, I think that's my take on the matter.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Dylan, back to you and back to the topic of AI. However, this time, as a business representative organization, we recognize that the current rules provide clear guidelines for AI at work. And we point to a number of points in our favor, such as AI literacy obligations on companies, instilling company policy around AI use, the obligation to inform employees of AI usage, and certain workplaces bans are in place for AI. Should employers try to be the first to adopt AI in their respective industries? And can you share examples of benefits that businesses might achieve from AI adoption?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. So the temptation is to say yes, they should be the first, but the practical answer is no. So it's not saying first is not the right ambition, right? So just to phrase it properly. So when a business is investing in AI, it should be a deliberate choice and investment in AI. So it's not a matter of there's AI, it's fancy, it's being hyped, so let's invest. That's never the right investment, and replace AI with any sort of technology or direction, and it's never a good idea for any business to do that. So sort of deploying AI reactively because a competitor did so, or there is some pressure, you end up sort of connecting AI to whichever thing you have running at the moment, which is running well enough because you're still operating. But then you end up breaking your workflows that are been already working, and then you don't see any positive return in the process. So the real value is to first invest in people, and investing in literacy throughout the organization. And my advice to any organization is that 100% of your employees have to be AI literate. And by AI literate means we know what AI is, and this is not what we mentioned before. And we're lucky as a nation that the government will be offering this training for free for everyone. So all businesses need to do is just ask their employees to do the National AI Literacy Program. By doing so, all businesses would have their workforce literate. So they create the first sort of human firewall within their entire organization. When there is literacy, and each individual can see how they can use AI on a personal level to be more comfortable in their everyday life, how to learn, etc., it will be second nature for them to suggest changes in workflows within the organization and the business that can be improved using AI. And it is at that moment that the business can have a very healthy conversation within the organization to introduce AI systems within the organization, because the flow and the workflows will improve because they will improve bottom up. And an employee in a company would not use AI because the CEO said so, but they would be the ones suggesting better workflows or more efficient ways of doing what we're doing as an organization, simply because now there is that level of literacy. So it's a balance. It doesn't mean that you have to wait and do nothing. But trying things out, encouraging and leaving a very open environment for a conversation within the organization, I believe it's extremely extremely healthy. So you also asked about benefits. So more or less, that is the real benefit, right? Because if everyone is understanding the situation, which is very fluid and very competitive in that way, and realizing that any organization can have instantly over a week an individual creating something using AI that can potentially disrupt the market or even compete with you directly, irrespective of how long you have been there. I think that's the benefit is make sure that there is literacy so you can address all these changes that are happening in the economy.
Thank you very much for that. You're providing a lot of food for thought for our audience. And with that, we are one step closer to finalizing the discussion on the Omnibus. So, Michael, the Omnibus also introduced a new file, which is the European Business Wallet. So from our consultation with the Malta Chamber members, there seems to be a positive outlook at the proposal for this so-called European Business Wallets. Can you explain what this proposal entails? What will these business wallets do? And why do you believe there's a need for such a harmonization tool among Maltese businesses?
Yes, definitely. So personally, I would say I've been looking forward to this for quite a few years, because the purpose of the wallet is to actually store the business documents once, and once you upload them on the wallet, they could be shared to anyone you're doing business with. So both on the procurement side and also on the selling side. And this idea helps a lot to reduce the administrative burden in that managing these business relationships take quite a bit of time. I'm sure you have experienced the KYC processes with financial institutions and the like. But on the other hand, it also helps with expanding, actually reducing friction between the digital markets. So having it as one single market, it allows you to interface with any other business that you need to do business with, build that trust quicker because there is a lot more transparency established on the platform. And you could also verify credentials as well. So both for companies and the products that they're selling as well. There's also an added value around it in that you can delegate authority through it. So you could actually put a senior manager in a position to negotiate on your behalf with that explicit authority on the wallet. So yeah, that's my take.
Thank you very much. As a side note, we will also be exploring further with an updated brief on this from our end, as well as a position paper. So thank you, and something for our audience to look out for. I'll move swiftly to the CSA2, given the time, and I would very much like us to get through as many questions as we can today. So Gavril, back to you this time. The Cybersecurity Act 2 introduces an EU-level certification for tech product system and processes. So what are some of the main implications of CSA2 to the local industry? What are the benefits of obtaining EU-wide certifications, and what type of hurdles and support local companies would have, please?
Thank you for asking. So the Cybersecurity Act, as you rightly said, introduces EU-wide certifications. So let's start from where we started prior to the Cybersecurity Act. A lot of member states, including Malta, had their own frameworks for cybersecurity certification, or for aspects associated with cybersecurity. In Malta, we have the Technology Assessment Recognition Framework, which also captures cybersecurity elements. Imagine you are operating a business in multiple jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction has its own certification program. So there is a clear advantage for business to have EU-wide certifications. Secondly, the Cybersecurity Act is voluntary, focuses on voluntary certifications. Yes, as you rightly said in your introduction, there can be the case that a procurement process or a supplier, because this applies also to industry, requires a certification, but that wouldn't emanate directly from the Cybersecurity Act. So we can have a circumstance that, for example, let's look at ISO 9001, which is a basic certification which a lot of Maltese companies apply for. You don't have a requirement in the law to be ISO 9001 certified, but you can have a procurement process which require the business operator to be ISO 9001 certified in Malta with or equivalent. So that is very important, or equivalent. So there are clear benefits to industry because EU-wide certifications really focus on key aspects which are of benefit to the consumer. And the MDIA is the National Cybersecurity Certification Authority under CSA. So there are different forms of certification. There's the basic, the substantial, and the high. The basic is done by through a self-assessment. So again, in Malta, around 4 years ago, we had already introduced a basic self-assessment. We called it Mind the Gap for cybersecurity, and we have associated some funding with it. Here, we're looking at certification through a self-assessment. The second is the high, which is done through a conformity assessment body. And yes, I agree with Michael that there's a big role for industry here, also in terms of supporting industry with consultancy, etc. And the third is the substantial. The substantial, the highest level, which, for example, can be used in some military environments, for example. The highest level is done through a conformity assessment body, but also with direct involvement of the National Cybersecurity Authority, Certification Authority, which is the MDIA. There are 3 options there. We can provide a general delegation to the conformity assessment body. We can either do it ourselves as MDIA, opting for the role of a conformity assessment body, or the third way is basically to give a prior approval to a company to do that on its to do the conformity assessment body. And that is the model, the third model, the prior approval model is the model which under the Cybersecurity Act MDIA has adopted, because it has the right balance in terms of oversight and industry involvement. One of the standards which is currently being proposed is also managed security services. So if I'm a company and I outsource my work to another company to manage my cybersecurity, personally, I would prefer that that company has some form of independent certification. So that's, but it's, at the end of the day, it's up to the specific companies to do those options. There's also a proposal to do some form of mechanism, certification framework to ensure compliance for NIS2 for essential entities. And I think that is a valid, also a valid proposal, because rather than, if you have a certification framework, rather than having the regulator coming, you have a certification body, so which provides an added layer in terms of preparedness, and it gives you really clearly what you need to prepare and what you need to have in place, and having an independent third party to check you. So we see a lot of benefits in terms of cybersecurity certifications. The first is trans-jurisdiction, which is something which our old model, let's say, was based on Malta, but if you want something which is certified, you want it to be available for all across the EU. The second is that you have a level of assurance on the quality of the services that you're being provided. Another one being proposed, for example, is on cloud computing. I had the pleasure last week to be in Slovakia to carry out the first peer review of another national cybersecurity certification authority. So even us as cybersecurity authorities are audited and regulated, and this June it will be Malta's turn to be peer reviewed by other competent authorities to see that we are up to standard also as MDIA. So what type of hurdles? First of all, I think there's companies, there are so many regulations that unless they see that sometimes it's even hard to catch up with regulations, let alone going for voluntary certification. So I think the baseline is definitely having your regulations being compliant with the regulations. That's why the Omnibus are important, because we're looking at further simplifications for companies. The second is having the access to an actual conformity assessment body and consultants and ecosystem with support certification. So again, we are working with the University of Malta to create another program focusing on preparing companies for conformity assessment, because there's a lot of knowledge and capacity and competence required, and that's basically the more competence we have, the more business we can attract, and the more our businesses will be compliant, and the more our consumers will be assured, and users, of the quality of service that are provided. To give you an idea, under a separate set of legislation, which is the Cyber Resilience Act, the process of compliance and conformity assessment is valued at €2 billion. We can simplify it, but if we want our products to have a toy at home, a doll at home for your child, and you have some level of assurance that that doll is up to date with patches and has, that comes at a cost. That's reality. Everything comes at a cost. But what we can do as Malta, and what our business can do, and I'm happy also to see Michael working in this area, is to place Malta as a center of excellence for compliance and conformity assessment in the field of digital innovation. So any company who is interested in focusing on building capacity on compliance and in the field of digital innovation, you'll find our support, and I'm sure also of that of entities such as Malta Enterprise, because like we built the financial services, the gaming industry, these are all industries which in reality are based on compliance. And that is what we believe also is an important niche for Malta, that these certifications, you can go to any, if you are based in Germany, you can go to any conformity assessment body based in the EU. So why not coming to one based in Malta? That's why we want to create this ecosystem. It's a lot driven by industry, because certifications are not issued by the regulator, but by industry. So we want companies to really invest in these areas. So yes, that is the main limitation. But what I think that what it will do, the CSA2 is, we call it CSA2, is the changes with the Omnibus, basically Cybersecurity Act version 2, is creating more role for these certifications. Because it's not just voluntary certifications as it is, but if you have this certification, it shows that you are compliant with legislation. And that makes it easier also to make this brand made in the EU, which is secure, safe, and innovative.
Perfect. Thank you for that very comprehensive overview and for setting the scene also locally in terms of CSA2. So Deo, in this case, the proposed CSA2 grants the European Commission new powers to ban high-risk suppliers and remove their products from the market. Industry experts warn that this could severely hamper competitiveness. Is there a concern for local businesses in your opinion?
Just to recap a bit, because we've spoken about the compliance framework, etc. Another important aspect of CSA2, and I think this is the more kind of controversial and unprecedented one, is the fact that it tries to recognize geopolitical risk in a way that kind of, in the technical environment is unprecedented. Because, before CSA2, you had cybersecurity, mainly a compliance framework, you had NIS2, it tells entities what measures to implement, how to report incidents. You have DORA, telling financial entities or their ICT suppliers how to manage risk, etc., etc. But CSA2 introduces something structurally different, because it gives the EU Commission, vis-a-vis an implementing act eventually, the power to determine a jurisdiction as high risk and mandate the phase out of components being used by companies that emanate from the jurisdiction. Now, to be clear, the CSA2 affects NIS2 entities. So in a nutshell, kind of, if you are an essential or important entity under NIS2, then an evaluation by the CSA2, which will say, listen, don't get any more components from that high jurisdiction, will affect directly only those entities. But of course, these kind of implementations have a lot of follow-on indirect effect, because if you are a company targeting or selling to NIS to entities directly, you do not fall under CSA2. But if the NIS2 entity wants to audit its suppliers and wants to ensure that its suppliers are compliant, then obviously indirectly you are still caught within the effect of CSA2. And that is, I think, the game changer and the concern, not just so for the entities that fall within it, but also for the entities that are selling to those other entities that fall under CSA2. Because as I said, this geopolitical realization of risk, I think it's quite unprecedented, and also the Commission can kind of, unilaterally also, and that is, I think, the criticism that's going on, determine a specific country. There is a process that is followed. First, the Commission coordinates risk assessments, and then they adopt and implement CNECT, and then suppliers established in or controlled or linked to those designated countries are classified automatically as high risk, with the follow-on effect, of course, that EU entities will need to phase them out. And the concern there is, you have an issue with procurement dependency, how to replace certain embedded infrastructure, for instance. You have also supply chain issues, and there are also issues on whether there is even an alternative. And in fact, that kind of criticism is being done in relation to telecoms, for instance, with 5G and future 6G, for instance. This is an area where the EU is already under an innovation kind of competitive pressure. So is there even an alternative if certain jurisdictions that manufacture or produce those kind of alternatives are determined as high risk? So that is kind of the practical effect of it. Now, for a more balanced alternative, I mean, I'm not really a policymaker. I stick to what is published and what to and how to interpret it. But I mean, it is clear that even if the CSA2, because it's good to remember that this is just a proposal, it's not finalized yet, but even if it's whittled down or some version of it, I think that geopolitical provenance as a risk is not going to go away. It is high on the agenda of the EU. So definitely this or some version of it will still make it. What I think a more balanced version is, I mean, the Commission has a spectrum of mitigation measures available to it, right? So it can apply these measures in a proportionate way that is calibrated to the actual function of the assets. So it shouldn't treat a router and the temperature sensor, and in the same manner, even though it can come from the same designated country. So I think this is how a more balanced kind of approach would be, and it is already the Commission can already do that, but of course. It needs to do that for a more balanced approach.
Thank you very much for that, Deo, and I'm very conscious of the time, so I will pass on the last question to Michael in this case. So the CSA2 brings a lot of new regulations, as we've heard from both Gavril and Deo. Which of its elements do you deem positive enough for Maltese businesses to get behind?
Yeah, so with the new regulations, and I think it's worth mentioning that some of them are even being drafted as we speak. There are a lot of advantages that depending on the product that you're selling or putting on the market, it might avail of you to tackle it differently. So we touched upon the CAB, presumption of conformity, but there are also the harmonized standards being written. And the harmonized standards are in a way being drafted in a way that a product pertaining to a certain industry or a certain vertical or even a mix, they would be able to have another vehicle at their disposal by which they become compliant. And this new way of thinking about it is not about, let's say, reducing the risk, but it is more of putting a product in some kind of figurative bucket. And that's if we talk, for example, about IoT devices are plenty. They're readily available, cheap enough, but you also need to guarantee that security updates on such devices are available for a minimum time span, which I believe it is 5 years. So at the moment, you cannot actually guarantee that these devices are being supported, not even patched. You might sometimes notice an update here or there on the firmware, which is done over the air, but there is very little thought into it when you buy an IoT device. With the changing regulation, it also explicitly states that whenever I buy an IoT device to use in my home, that has to be secure by default as well, which brings a new paradigm. Because at the moment, you had to have some technical intellect to actually create an AP on the device, connect to it, configure it, and possibly even you won't even have the option to secure it. Now that has to change from the get-go. So even at design stage, the manufacturers have to think of a way that that device can be in a sort of plug and play mode into your home, secure by default, configured and ready to run, and also has unique passwords even when comparing devices of the same type in the market. So maybe you notice these stickers that come with modems or routers whenever you install that into your home. That sticker has a unique username password on it, and when you actually connect to it, you just have to scan that code. I would expect that something similar will also happen to digital products. Now, because they're digital, there is kind of an argument on where that sticker will be, because obviously it's not something tangible and something that you can scan. But the direction is there. And with that in mind, I believe the upside for Maltese businesses is that whenever you get your product certified, be it in a self-certified manner or the CAP or the standards, there is that is an actual stamp that is recognizable to all the EU. So with that in mind, it should become much easier to proliferate your products to the larger market and take advantage of the single market as well.
Thank you very much. And with that, I thank all of our speakers. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. These are topics that we could speak at length on. We've had a very informative session today, led by experts in the field.